Welcome to this report on the state of Australia in 2022. I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of Australian Community Futures Planning, or ACFP. And in this two-part video series, I'm summarising the findings of a major report we've produced, which provides Australians with their first comprehensive picture of our well-being and security as a nation and our preparedness for the future. This is part two of the series. In the first part, I covered findings about Australia's economic performance in the decade to 2022 and the capacity of our current economic policies to deliver a better standard of living for all of us. This second and final part covers key findings about our society, environment, governance and foreign relations policies over the last decade and their impact on our well-being, security and economic strength. In part one, I also explained how ACFP has built a national planning and performance monitoring framework called National Integrated Planning and Reporting. We've built it to help Australians begin to plan the sort of future they want and develop safe strategies to help them make a better Australia. I explained how we're using that framework to help Australians keep tabs on the answer to an important question. Are we progressing towards a better Australia? In part one, I outlined the results of our report on the state of Australia in 2022 on the economy and showed that on balance, we are not progressing towards a better Australia. Over the last decade or more, we have not been travelling towards the sort of economy we've said we want. And the main reason for that is the neoliberal economic policies prevailing throughout that period. These policies have not delivered the growth, jobs, productivity, better wages, security, or the housing we need. They have delivered inequality, growing poverty, hunger and homelessness. In this episode, I'm going to look at other policies that have contributed to this sorry set of results, because even with all the evidence in the report of the damage that neoliberalism has done, it's not the only policy that has dragged the economy and our standard of living backwards. Australia has a range of policies that have prevailed over the last 2 decades and longer, each of which has left our standard of living behind where it might otherwise have been. These include structured systems of discrimination against women and gender diverse Australians, disregard of the natural environment and biodiversity, climate policy, intransigence and support of fossil fuels, disregard by politicians of their accountability to us, and growing corruption within our political system, and finally, hawkish, increasingly aggressive warmongering in our foreign policy. It's worth having a brief look at each of these because we're being made to pay a heavy price for them. Australia has increased the extent to which it routinely excludes women from participation in the economy and consigns them to the lowest paid jobs. Relative to other countries, Australia's performance in achieving gender equality in areas including economic opportunity and participation, health and survival and political empowerment has fallen dramatically over the last 2 decades. The only positive sign is that we retain the #1 spot for levels of educational attainment by women. But this picture tells you that the educational opportunities we provide for women and their outstanding achievements there do not translate to a job for women at the same rate as they do for men. Everybody would probably know this intuitively, but what they might not know is that other countries have found a way to improve all that. By contrast, we've gone backwards, big time, falling 58 places in world rankings on economic participation and opportunity for women since 2006. That's 58 countries who figured out how to do this better and faster than us. You'll be told by our governments that the gender pay gap is closing. But if it is, which is doubtful, it is closing at best at a snail's pace. In 2021, the Australian Government Workplace Gender Equality Agency reported that in 7 years the gender pay gap had fallen from 24.7% to 20.1%. But candidly, they also said that at this rate of change it would take another 26 years for the full-time gender pay gap for total remuneration to close. A few months later, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency became a little less candid and tried to make out that the gap was only half that size by focusing only on full-time pay rates, ignoring low earnings of the 44% of women who work part-time. When you put them into the picture and look at the full data set from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, it doesn't provide confidence that the gender pay gap is closing at all. Indeed, it shows the gap is widening. In 2010, the median of women's total annual remuneration was 73% of men's. By 2018, the latest ABS data set showed that women's pay had fallen to 70% of men's pay. That's a widening gap, not a closing one. The picture might be a little better on superannuation, at least until 2018. Between 2010 and 2018, the median superannuation balance for women rose from 53% of men's to 65%. Good. But men still had half as much again in their balances as women. The women's balances hadn't even got above where men's were 6 years before. Since COVID-19, given that so many women and men were forced to withdraw from their superannuation balances just to survive, it's likely that when new data are eventually released by the ABS, they'll show a decline in balances for men and women, and probably a worsening of the gap. All manner of stalling tactics have been in play over the last decade that have prevented closure of the gender gap. Despite a legislative framework which prohibits gender discrimination, no effective action has been taken to lift the prospects and circumstances of women and gender-diverse Australians. The single exception is legislation permitting same-sex marriage. A reform itself stalled for more than a decade by government inaction and outright resistance to the will of the majority of Australians. But since the reform, campaigns have been led by the Morrison government to wind back that hard-won equality again. Attempts to remove institutional benefits for gender-diverse Australians have emerged anew during the 46th Parliament in the form of the Morrison government's Religious Discrimination Bill, although this has recently been withdrawn. Still, the aim of the Religious Discrimination Bill was to reduce job prospects for gay, lesbian and other Australians of diverse gender and sexual orientation. It's been divisive and plainly counterproductive, since the only effect we can get from persisting with this type of inequality and exclusion from participation in the workforce and in education is a smaller economy. A smaller and more unstable economy is also the only result we could have expected from national policies on the environment, biodiversity and climate change. Over the last 20 years, we have witnessed the decimation of much of our natural environment and biodiversity. Stewardship of ecology has not been a priority policy. An independent review of our custodianship of the environment and our policies for conservation, finalised during the 46th Parliament, says it all. We have the worst track record for species loss in the world. Fraud or corruption in trading of water in regional Australia, along with poor planning for integrated ecosystem management, has brought on several crises for biodiversity and the economic sustainability of regions. And these all occurred before the bushfires and floods from 2020 onwards. Australian policymakers seem to think the natural environment, biodiversity and water are inexhaustible resources that can somehow be endlessly plundered or destroyed outright for economic gain, when the reality is that our economic prosperity and fundamental survival as a species depends on how well we act as stewards of all other species and their habitats. And of course, nowhere have we threatened the survival of all life on Earth, including our own, more than in our climate policy over the last 20 years. It should have been easy for a wealthy nation like Australia to lead the world in transition to a new economy based on renewable energy and cessation of fossil fuel use. But Australia's record on climate policy and cooperation needs to be called out for what it is. It's nothing short of appalling. we have progressively tumbled down in the rankings of the International Climate Change Performance Index until we've reached the bottom of the list of 64 participating countries. And we're hurting no one as much as ourselves in the process by persistent, unethical and uncooperative behaviour on the international stage. According to Melbourne University, our inaction on transition of our fossil fuel-based economy to one based on renewable energy will cost Australia a minimum of $584 billion over the decade to 2030 and $762 billion by 2050. Our current policies will cost us this as a minimum. The cost will rise to more than $5 trillion by the end of the century if we don't reverse those policies right now. By contrast, it would cost us only about $35 billion in damages if we worked with the rest of the world to do all things necessary to keep global heating below 1.5 degrees Celsius. It should be pretty easy to work out which one of those bills we might prefer to add to our national debt for our kids to pay. National debt has ballooned since the global financial crisis from $55 billion, or a mere 4.7% of GDP in 2008, to $963 billion, or 45.1% of GDP in 2022. The federal government has predicted the debt will grow to almost $1,200 billion, or 50% of GDP, by 2025. We're being told that we can expect this debt will be paid off over the coming decades because we have an economy that is set to grow strongly. This is not a plausible claim, since we are proposing to do nothing different in managing of the economy than we have been doing over the last decade, and that did not result in strong growth. But even if we achieve the optimistically expected growth, it's unlikely that our debt will do anything other than balloon again between now and 2030 due to that little matter of $584 billion in economic losses we will rack up because of our climate policies. The Parliamentary Budget Office has foreshadowed that federal government debt will still be above 50% of GDP by 2030. But unless we change our climate policies radically, we should assume that our federal government debt will be at least $584 billion, or around 50% higher in dollar terms by 2030 than either Treasury or the Parliamentary Budget Office have yet predicted. Without a change in climate policies, we're looking at debt being above 60% of GDP by 2030, so we're not prepared for the future. But there is a possible upside. Almost all of the losses foreshadowed by Melbourne Uni here are still avoidable if we reverse our policy direction on climate change and commit to reaching net zero carbon emissions without emitting more than our fair share of the remaining emissions that the whole world may still release to the atmosphere before we reach irreversible tipping points of heating. Australia's fair share of those remaining emissions is probably no more than 3.5 billion tonnes of carbon equivalents between 2020 and whenever we reach net zero emissions. That's as much as we should ever be able to release in total if we are to make up for climate change intransigence and save our country and livelihoods. However, no Australian government has yet acknowledged this reality and the necessity of stopping emissions before we reach the tipping point. That can only be done if each country accepts a carbon budget. At the rate we are going at the moment, it might be expected that Australia will make some progress towards switching to renewable energy before 2035, but it is very unlikely to be enough to stop the heating if we do not at the same time limit our remaining emissions so that they never exceed 3.5 billion more tonnes. And if we do not at the same time help the rest of the world to do the same in fair proportions. For Australia's part, we should aim to reduce our emissions by about 50 million tonnes a year. Might sound like a lot, but it's actually still feasible. And if we start straight away, we can be carbon neutral by about 2035 and restore our economic prosperity in the process. It would make it easier if we reintroduced a price on carbon and switched all transport and vehicles to renewable energy. you'd like more information on this, you can watch any of ACFP's videos on essential climate change solutions on YouTube. It would also make it easier to stop global heating if we rebuilt our reputation as an ethical carbon trader. This is unfortunately something which we lost recently. Australia used to have a good reputation as a fair trader of legitimate carbon credits. That's credits which, if bought, would genuinely help the buyers offset their greenhouse gas emissions. The recent news that our certification standards for credits amount to a fraud on taxpayers and the environment is the latest example of Australia's slide into a cesspit of government-sponsored corruption and unethical conduct, all of which in turn is adversely affecting the national economy. There is environmental benefit and economic expansion ready for the taking if Australia makes a genuine effort to behave ethically in this emerging market of carbon trading. But our reputation there has just taken a big hit, as has our reputation for ethical conduct in general. In the 10 years to 2021, Australia's score on the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index dropped by 12 points to reach its lowest point since the start of the index. New Zealand and Denmark currently occupy first place with 88 points each. We were never that good, but now we are 15 points behind them. Australia used to be ranked in the very clean category on this index. Not anymore. In fact, it's hard to find an international ranking table that Australia hasn't sunk down in during the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments. On some, we've sunk to the absolute bottom. Corruption is everywhere in Australia and people see it in levels they could never see before. It flourishes in the areas of water allocation and trading, pollution control, development approvals, and perhaps most notably in the sale of public assets for far less than their worth. That one in particular amounts to a grand theft of the public's assets. Corruption also flourishes in the growth of the market irregularities that are being permitted by the government. It flourishes in interference with public servants in the course of their duty, something that especially applies to the ABC, auditors of government conduct and state and federal police. And there is the sort of interference that led to the illegal conduct by public servants in the robo-debt scandal. It flourishes in lobbyists who have Parliament House passes, something you and I don't have. It flourishes in electoral funding distortions, in pork barrelling, and in employment of ministers on their retirement by companies and lobbying firms in their area of ministerial responsibility. That one is the equivalent of ministers accepting bribes, big bribes. Corruption is flourishing at the federal level of government because both major parties have refused to support the introduction of even a basic binding code of conduct. Yes, that's both major parties. And the Morrison government has failed to deliver on its promise to establish a federal corruption watchdog. The Labor Party was promising to turn that one around, but we should watch that the standards that may be enforced by such a body are tightened. There's not much point in having a Federal Integrity Commission, even one with teeth, if the standard they can hold politicians to account for isn't itself the highest ethical standard. That sort of watchdog would have no teeth. The impact of all this on our economy is clear. For the last 20 years, Australians have been forced to support an economy based on fossil fuels at the expense of far more productive structures for a modern economy. Corruption has driven the economy into a system of favours for industries like mining that are currently providing few, if any, new jobs, and away from industries that already provide vastly higher numbers of jobs than mining and can easily provide more. Those industries are health, education, welfare, renewable energy, rebooted manufacturing, conservation, land care, aged care, childcare, disability care, and housing. They, and not mining, are the job creation colossus, so cutting funds for them makes no sense, especially at a time when we will need all the growth in national revenue that we can get from productive labour in these sectors if we're to fund our defence in an increasingly unstable and fractious international situation. Australia's bills for defence are about to rise, and this is not because our region of the world, the Asia Pacific, has become more dangerous. It hasn't yet. But if it is beginning to get more dangerous, it is we who are making it that way, with our current aggressive foreign policy and provocative defence postures. Our defence bills are about to rise because hawks in Australia's defence sector, funded by foreign arms dealers, people who make extraordinary profits by beating the drums of war, have done their best to assert that China has suddenly become an aggressor as opposed to merely assertive and protective of its interests as any sovereign nation would be. And the news media have fallen in with this theme that China is a military aggressor. It might be persuasive were it not for the fact that, unlike Western colonising powers, particularly the British Empire, China over hundreds of years has next to no record of aggression beyond its borders. Aside from a very short incursion into Vietnam in the 1970s during the Vietnam War for less than a month, China has no history of invasion of other sovereign powers anywhere beyond its immediate region. Their history is instead one of being locked in tightly by their geography, by the Himalayas, the steppes of Central Asia, and 14 other countries on the land side, and later by American containment on their only coast. Their history is one not of invading, but of being invaded over more than 2 centuries, or appallingly exploited within their borders by powers like the UK, Japan, the United States, and yes, even Australia during the Boxer Rebellion. China's assertiveness pales in comparison to that of Western powers. If it is becoming more assertive of its interests, then based on its history, it's more likely to be the natural reaction for its own defence, and China is doing nothing more than we would reasonably seek to do to protect our interests and peace in our homeland. But instead of seeking to build a relationship with China, we are overreacting to their inevitable rise. We are ourselves making the region more dangerous by escalating armaments and shifting to submarines powered by nuclear reactors. We are webbing ourselves tightly to the US alliance instead of seeking to develop an independent defence capability befitting the 30th biggest economy in the world, which we are. We are ceding sovereignty in our decisions about war and peace to the US. More than that, we're setting ourselves up as the site of a proxy war. If what the hawks say about China being aggressive, as opposed to proportionally defensive, is true, then the last thing Australia should do is set itself up as target number 1. But that is exactly what we are doing, by a front foot strategy of nuclear submarines designed specifically for intrusion into regions beyond our own to attack and kill. Making ports in Australia for submarines powered by nuclear reactors is a senseless strategy for a second or third order power like Australia. It's like planting a nuclear bomb in our front yard, and we're proposing to do that at inordinate expense. Everyone, except the arms dealers, would benefit if we reversed our aggression, left the US to their own devices, and stopped providing funds for their arms escalation, since all it does is help the US prosecute war in our hitherto comparatively stable region of the world. American attempts to contain China's rise are destined to be prohibitively expensive for Australia. We will have more to lose than we will gain. If anything is certain about the future of our region, it is that we will regret participation in containment efforts against China much more than we would regret cooperative participation in regional development that lifts the whole Asia Pacific region to a similar level of prosperity to our own. If Australia is hell-bent on expensive arms escalation, and our intelligence agencies have some sort of secret information that squarely suggests that such an escalation is necessary, then increased defence spending should at least not occur without establishing a strategy to help us avoid as much of those bills as possible. At the moment, just as we have no strategy in place to avoid the future costs of climate change, we also have no strategy in place to help us avoid the future costs of war. when it comes to these two foreseeable existential threats, climate change and nuclear war, Australia's governments are plunging headlong in the wrong direction. They have failed to rise to a leadership role in building a peaceful region. Still, we do have the option of setting an example for the rest of the world about genuine respect for the sovereignty of other nations. In plain sight at the moment, we have an example of what can happen when we and the West don't respect the sovereignty of other nations. We have a war in Ukraine in 2022, which would have been far less likely if the US had not led a 30-year-long push by NATO right up to the Russian border. Now that we've seen what can happen, surely we should not be letting the US repeat that strategy in our part of the world. We should not be aiding their aggressive pivot to Asia and their obsessive attempts to contain China's rise if we don't want the sort of conflict we can see in the Ukraine on our doorstep in 10 or 20 years' time. This is plain common sense. The last line of the Vision for Australia Together says that by 2050 we will be living a fulfilling life where we take pride in Australia as a responsible international citizen, active in building a safer, more peaceful and united world. And the direction in the vision for peace and security is a signpost that says, on the way to that vision, Australia will become a nation assured of enduring peace. But the prevailing strategies in our defence establishment at the moment are setting us up to become a nation assured of enduring war. We're going precisely the wrong way. Fortunately, there are alternative strategies still available for the choosing, and the data in the report on the state of Australia in 2022 shows that Australians are ready and willing to choose them. One way we can best protect our security in our region is by shaping up as an ethical country, living the values of a free and open democracy. If we want other countries like China to respect human rights and freedoms, then a good place to start would be to respect them ourselves. Unfortunately, the report on the State of Australia 2022 shows that we are losing our rights and freedoms, not at the hand of China, but at the hand of our own government. More than 80 pieces of legislation since 2002 have effectively removed several of the freedoms we have enjoyed as an open society, particularly the rights we might have assumed to free speech, peaceful protest and a free press. Credible commentators now designate Australia as arguably the most secretive democracy in the Western world. Secrecy, criminalisation of journalism and raids on journalists' homes and files are having a chilling effect on our free press, and it is notable that Australia is now the only democracy in the Western world without a Bill of Rights or a human rights framework. We have nothing in our constitution that says our rights can't be taken away, and they are being taken away. They've been steadily extinguished by a program of national security legislation which has promoted secrecy and ostensible security over an open and free society. Anyone wishing to blow the whistle on corruption and crimes in our security establishment, and even in some areas like taxation, now can't do so without facing the prospect of a jail term. We are witnessing the rise of the secret state in Australia, and that can't be represented as progress towards the Vision for Australia Together. It is so lacking in imagination about the sort of open democratic country that we could be building that it has reached a point where if we do not release ourselves from the prohibitions and secrecy we are experiencing now due to this incessant program of legislation, we will soon no longer be able to protest for freedom and campaign for the society we want at all. We won't be able to use our democracy to save our democracy because it's been weakened from within. Fortunately, Australia has not sunk so low yet that we can't swing this around. We haven't yet arrived at serious danger points for total breakdown of our democracy. We haven't, for instance, sunk down like the United States, which saw its democracy seriously threatened in the attacks on its capital in January 2021. Although, judging by these pictures, we're getting uncomfortably closer to that sort of violent civil unrest. The data in the state of Australia show we are, on some measures, heading the way of America, but we're not quite there yet. And this type of breakdown is therefore something we can still prevent. There's a positive possibility there. And to end this sorry story on a positive note, it has to be said that the data in the report also show that there is a will among Australians to restore their democracy by making it one that more Australians can participate in. That's one of those glimmers of hope I spoke of in part 1 of this video series. Despite it all, or perhaps because of all the rotten things that we can see are going on, Australians are calling for a better Australia. You have to look hard into the data to find this, but it's there. There are lots of Australians who sense how bad things have become and they don't want to come any closer to the sort of social breakdown we can see in America. There is a sense in the data that the will of the nation is for the opposite of that. And this is showing up in the rise of things like the Voices of movement, something that has been driven by the disappointment of Australians with the coalition government's inaction on climate change and the growth of government corruption. In fact, voices are rising everywhere. The Me Too movement has helped more women find their voice, and at last, the voice is too loud now to be easily ignored. Hear me now, said Grace Tame, and it seems they are beginning at last to hear. And of course, the most joyous and harmonious rise of voices has emerged from First Nations people in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Australians are rising to acknowledge our Indigenous heart. There is a groundswell of calls for acknowledgement and resolution of the struggles of the past and the illegal, inhumane and immoral faults of the founding of our nation. There is also evidence of a willingness to affirm our connection to each other and to this land, and in the process, make Australia anew. Australians may not necessarily see that this is evident in the detail of our responses to surveys on our attitudes, but if we put the pieces of this report together, it indicates that there is a desire to make a new start. Every time we hear yet another non-Indigenous Australian acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded by First Nations, we can see the time is coming for creation of a new and better Australia by walking together with Indigenous Australians. Non-Indigenous Australians have been given a most gracious invitation from First Nations to come together after these struggles and establish a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. It's a magnificent opportunity to make the most wonderful country peaceably, without civil war. We would need to guard against the evident current of rising racism in Australia, a negative current which can be seen in the results in the State of Australia 2022 about our social cohesion and our attitudes to multiculturalism. But evidence of the readiness for reconciliation is in the results in roughly equal measure to that rise in racism, and that can be built on. Otherwise, the most promising and hopeful set of results in the State of Australia in 2022 is present in the apparent preparedness of Australians to come together to rebuild after the pandemic, and in the recognition that a fully capable, energetic and competitive public sector is essential to our health, well-being and future prosperity. It's not a dead weight. Glimmers of hope are also apparent in the evidence of our rejection of growing inequality and an obvious readiness to do everything necessary to prevent climate change and seize the positive economic opportunities that spill out from that for all of us. Looking at the data in the report in this way, it's clear that the positive results all relate to our attitudes rather than our physical, economic and environmental circumstances, which at this moment are not good. There is a recognition that we have fallen in our circumstances to what we should hope is the bottom. And there is awareness that we are at a turning point as a nation and longing to build a better, safer life and home. And we're interested in safer paths of travel for our kids. This seems to be an emergent strength of the nation that we should not let slip away again. It's kind of like a regrouping after a shock. Australians are now interested in solving our most serious problems, particularly climate change and inequality, to a degree that they have never been before. And for that purpose, they're beginning to mobilise in new political approaches that are less ideologically driven and less slavishly devoted to partisan groupings in politics. That emergent strength can be capitalised on if we organise ourselves well. Distrust of governments and politics ballooned over the decade to 2019, as only it might when corruption of governments is so shamelessly on open display and ideological rigidity has been so deeply embedded in the party political system. But since the pandemic, Australians are a little more inclined to trust governments again. They want to be able to rely on them, and they want them to undertake reforms for the purpose of cementing both that trust and the future itself. In other words, they want reforms that will make governments ethical once again. And although the rise in trust during the pandemic hasn't really been sustained, it's fragile, there is still a new readiness to reinvigorate Australia's democracy for everyday Australians so that they can take up bigger shares of power and more control over their future. This will require a transition from a merely representative democracy to a participatory democracy. In turn, this will require a new constitution, the People's Constitution. The one we have at the moment is over 120 years old, and while it's suited to a representative democracy where voters give up power totally to governments to let them do what they like, it's not suited to the power-sharing arrangements needed for an educated society seeking to reap the benefits of living in a decent, mature democracy with checks and balances on power. So stay tuned for more on the People's Constitution from ACFP in the next parliamentary term. Finally, if Australians are to take the biggest shares of power that they need, they will need skills that enable them to rise above short-term party political agendas. They will need skills and a process by which they can collaborate to plan a better future. This will require us to use the new process of national integrated planning and reporting. It's there to help us engage with each other within our democracy in an orderly fashion. It's there to help us build an efficient, participatory democracy. It creates a live space of planning, monitoring and open reporting that anyone can use to inject safe and effective strategies for national progress and check whether we're moving along those lines. It can help us check a government's performance and fitness for office, and it can help us plan how we prefer to fund it all. National IPNR has now been made freely available to Australians, and one of the first things we've been able to use it for is to identify the 20 critical areas of national failure that must be fixed by 2030 if we're to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of wellbeing and security for everyone. Australia has the human capacity and more than enough wealth to solve every one of these 20 issues within 5 to 10 years if we address those 20 critical issues in an integrated way. National IPNR gives Australians the means of achieving this together. It gives us the means of reversing the decline of our democracy and the division of our society that has been driven into it since the early 2000s. It enables all Australians for the first time to participate in building a plan for a future that every one of us and every one of our children can share. Australia together. ACFP hopes that this first end-of-term report assists Australians in building a plan that will result in a much better end-of-term report on our nation during the 47th Parliament, the State of Australia 2025. You can become involved in planning a better Australia by visiting ACFP's website at www.ausgcfp.com.au. There's some exciting things in the starting draft of Australia Together that benefit everyone, rich and poor alike. So everyone is welcome to participate. Thanks for watching this video series. If you like this program, please click like on the YouTube page and share the program with your friends and subscribe to this channel.